Students, teachers, this is the moment we've been waiting for. Finally, CSEC gives us an easy poem. Well, that's only half true. In terms of what happens in the poem, we can consider Landscape Painter Jamaica to be one of the most straightforward poems on the syllabus. The speaker watches a painter paint the Blue Mountains. However, when it comes on to assessing the poetic language used, we'll find that this poem is packed with devices that add depth and detail that are worth spending considerable time unpacking. As usual, we'll start with a reading of the poem. Then we will do a quick summary of what happens. After that, we'll do a line-by-line analysis. Then we'll wrap it up by looking at the themes explored. Landscape Painter Jamaica by Vivian Virtue for Albert Huie. I watch him set up easel, both straddling precariously a corner of the twisted climbing mountain track. A tireless hummingbird, his brush dips, darts, hovers now here, now there, where puddles of pigment bloom in the palette's wild small garden. The mountains pose for him in a family group, dignified, self-conscious against the wide blue screen of morning. Low green foothills sprawl like grandchildren about the knees of seated elders. And behind them, aloof, shouldering the sky, patriarchal in serenity, Blue Mountain Peak bulks. And the professional gaze studies positions, impatiently waiting for the perfect moment to fix their preparedness, to confine them for the pleasant formality of the family album. His brush a hummingbird, meticulously poised, the little hills fidgeting, changelessly changing, artlessly frustrating the painter's art. Let's go stanza by stanza and summarize what happens. In stanza 1, the speaker watches the persona, an artist, set up his easel on a mountain track. By stanza 2, the painter starts painting. His paintbrush, like a hummingbird, moves swiftly and skillfully across the canvas. And like flowers blooming in a wild garden, rich, vibrant colors fill the canvas, bringing life and meaning to the once blank space. By the last stanza, the painter's brush is poised like a hummingbird, getting ready to depict the mountains perfectly. The speaker's tone is one of intrigue, admiration, and bemusement as she observes a painter's process of depicting an important landscape. The poem might relay a mood of fascination, wonder, reflection, or appreciation for art or for nature, or both. Now, let's get to the line-by-line analysis. The title is clear and fitting. The poem is about a landscape painter, one who does paintings of natural sceneries. These landscapes, as the title suggests, can be found in Jamaica. More interesting than the title itself is the poem's dedication. We see for Albert Huie. Who is or was this person? He was born in Trelawney, Jamaica in 1920. He died in 2010. He was not only a great painter, but an artistic genius, a prodigy. He produced his first painting, The Dancers, at the age of 16, and that was the beginning of what was to be an illustrious career. He is now hailed as the father of Jamaican painting, a title that reflects how much of a pioneer he was at his craft. His work included, but was far from limited to, landscape painting. Interestingly, though he covered various locations in his paintings, I could not find a painting of Blue Mountain Peak under his name. Perhaps the poet is giving us a rare glimpse into one of his unpublished works. Or this might be the speaker's imagination of how Huie might have gone about painting the Blue Mountain Peak. Perhaps the location here does not matter as much as the process and art form, the meaning of art, the relationship between art and nature, between art and life. Note also that there is no certainty that the painter in the poem is in fact Albert Huie or any version of him. Let's head down to the first stanza, which is actually one sentence. I watch him set up easel, both straddling precariously a corner of the twisted climbing mountain track. As mentioned in the summary, the speaker watches the artist set up his easel on a mountain track. The literal happening is clear, but the language used calls for some discussion. In line 2, we see that they are both straddling precariously a corner of the twisted climbing mountain track. The artist and the easel are both straddling the track. In regular use, straddling something means sitting or standing on something with one leg on either side, the way one sits on a horse to ride it. So we can imagine a very narrow mountain track, a trail within the mountains, a road carved naturally or perhaps by mountaineers. The artist and easel are straddling the track, so he is on one side while the easel is standing on the other. The track runs in between them. As stated just now, in regular usage, straddling something means sitting or standing on it with one leg on either side. It is usually a verb ascribed to humans. The easel here might be personified into being not only the artist's tool, but his partner. As a pair of riders may together straddle a horse, so do the artist and his easel straddle the mountain as partners. Anyhow, what are they straddling? They're straddling the mountain track. They're taking position in this tight, awkward, perilous space. Look at the word precariously in line 2. The word means dangerously, perilously, as in the manner in which one might navigate a precipice, or in this case, a mountain track. The artist and easel are in a dangerous place, but precariously modifies not only how the artist and easel straddle the mountain track, but also the environment. We see that the mountain track and perhaps the mountain in general, perhaps the entire landscape, are something the artist and easel must in a sense tame, conquer even. In a similar vein, precarious means unstable or insecure. The artist might intend not necessarily to defeat, but to stabilize, to secure the landscape. What does this mean? It means the artist intends to capture and immortalize the mountain in a painting. Look at the imagery in the stanza and you will see that it centers around the precariousness of the mountain track. We see that they're in a corner of a twisted climbing track. The track is twisted, which adds to its precariousness. It is also steep, hence the word climbing. But the word climbing here also personifies the track, as it is said to be climbing as if it were itself a mountain climber. The personification adds life to the environment. The artist, as he sets up to paint the landscape, is painting life. We see a lot more personification of the mountains and hills as we continue. Furthermore, the word climbing introduces a sense of progression, journeying, one that reflects the process of art as the canvas journeys into its transformation into a magnificent picture. Let us backtrack to the word straddling from line 2. This word, through a clever metaphor, compares the mountain track to a horse or any animal that is often ridden, straddled by humans. This again emphasizes the life within the landscape, but it also serves two other purposes. For one, it reinforces the relationship between the landscape and the landscape painter. He is straddling the landscape, riding it as if it were a horse or a donkey. He is in control. He is dominating, mastering the landscape. The second effect of the metaphor is that it suggests that the landscape is a vehicle used by the artist, the vehicle which eventually brings the artist to the art. The addition of the horse works well with the journey motif hinted at by climbing in line 3. Let's look at lines 5 and 6. A tireless hummingbird, his brush dip starts, hovers now here, now there. The painter is done setting up his easel. Now he is hard at work. Well, it seems it's not quite him, but his brush that is hard at work. The paintbrush, through metaphor, is said to be a hummingbird. It is also tireless, which means it can keep on working forever without getting tired. It is determined to get this work done. Just as the easel was given life, now the brush is given life. This reflects the philosophy that art creates itself. Stories write themselves and pictures paint themselves, in the sense that the artist cannot control or restrict the unfolding of the art. Also, by becoming a hummingbird, the paintbrush has become a part of nature, establishing the unbreakable connection between the painting of the landscape and the landscape itself, between the painter's tools and what they depict. What is so special about a hummingbird? First, the national bird of Jamaica, the doctor bird, is a type of hummingbird. Why is this important? Consider that this painter is painting the Blue Mountain Peak, which is the climax of the Blue and John Crow Mountains National Park in Jamaica. This park is also a World Heritage Site. It is the highest peak in Jamaica, and it boasts the best coffee in the world. The point is, this is a special place, one of national, regional, even global significance. The artist's brush must be worthy of painting such a place. It must become a hummingbird, the national bird of Jamaica, and a bird with several unique qualities and abilities. Importantly, hummingbirds are the only birds that can fly backwards, and they can change their flight direction rapidly. Also, they are the only birds that can hover for an extended period of time, meaning they can stay at one spot in the air like a helicopter. These features of the bird are reinforced in the next line as we see that the hummingbird, which is the paintbrush, dips, darts, hovers, now here, now there. In line 6, we see that the brush is moving across the canvas as skillfully and as quickly as a hummingbird. We get some kinesthetic imagery in the line as the speedy and agile movements of the brush is described. The shortness of the words in the line also adds to that sense of rapid movement, with all but one of the words being monosyllabic. Let's go to line 7 and 8. Puddles of pigment bloom in the palette's wild small garden. This is more visual imagery. First, we saw the movements of the paintbrush. Now we're seeing the colorfulness, the vibrance of the paint on the canvas. What are the puddles of pigment in line 7? The pigment is the paint, or more accurately, it is what gives the paint its color. The artist is working with paint of various colors, of various pigmentations. The pigment is said to be puddles. Since they're not literally puddles, this is a metaphor. It can also be seen as hyperbole, as actual puddles are much larger than the blobs or splashes of paint. The artist uses a palette, a small surface, usually of wood or plastic. On the palette, they would have blobs of various paints. The artist then dips his paintbrush into these blobs in order to paint. The paint is said to be in puddles not only to overstate the size of the blobs of paint, but also to continue to connect the tools of art to the nature it imitates. Puddles are a natural part of nature, as they form whenever it rains. In fact, the word pigment serves to further connect the paint to nature, as pigment in biology refers to any color in plant or animal cells. An example of a pigment is chlorophyll, which makes plants green. These puddles of pigment, according to line 8, bloom in the palette's wild small garden. We have another strong metaphor reinforcing the connection between the tools of art and nature, as now the paints are said to be blooming as if they were flowers. The paint blooms because it becomes beautiful. Flowers are more beautiful when they bloom. The blooming also indicates a transformation of the paint. When flowers bloom, their appearance changes. Now, the blobs of paint are turning into a picture. Where does this blooming happen? It happens in the garden of the palette, as the metaphor continues. The palette here may refer to the piece of wood or plastic the blobs of paint are on, but the palette may also mean the colors themselves, the range of colors the artist uses. The palette's garden is small because the palette itself, meaning the object the paint is on, is physically small. The garden is wild because the different colors can be mixed and matched into countless ways to create countless images. Besides, we know that the brush is moving swiftly across the canvas, flinging colors left and right. Note the alliteration in lines 7 and 8. The p sound is repeated in puddles, pigment, and palettes, reinforcing the connection among these three words and adding a phonetic power to the wildness of the garden. Lines 9-10. The mountains pose for him in a family group. Heading into the third stanza, we get a look at what the mountains are doing. In stanza 1, the mountain track was perilous. Now it seems the artist has conquered nature into submission. Now the mountains pose for him in a family group. The mountains are here personified. They bid the artist to paint them. They are looking their best and posing. The artist sees nature as wanting to be painted, wanting to be made into art. We see also that the mountains are in a family group, further personifying them. This means the mountains appear unified. They complement one another. Lines 11-12. Dignified, self-conscious against the wide blue screen of morning. We see that personification continues into line 11 as the mountains are now dignified and self-conscious. They're dignified because they're not just ordinary mountains, but they are the blue mountains. They are respectable, even majestic, and they reflect that sense of importance in how they pose for the artist. They are also self-conscious, a descriptor that could either have a positive or negative connotation. Positively, it means the mountains are self-aware. They know themselves, they know what they are, and that is why they are so dignified. Negatively, it means they are uncomfortable or overly concerned with their appearance or behavior. Perhaps they are nervous before the artist, doing their best to look and act their best, worried about spoiling the landscape painting. The mountains are about to be immortalized in this painting, and so they are doing their best to make sure the image that is captured of them is most glorious. The mountains are taking this creation of art seriously. Reaching down into line 12, we have a metaphor as the sky is said to be the wide blue screen of morning. This is some wonderful imagery that shows that the mountains create a visual contrast against the backdrop of the blue sky. The blueness of the sky means that it is a beautiful day to create a landscape painting. The weather is nice and the natural lighting is excellent. Not only the mountains we see, but the entirety of nature does its best to facilitate this landscape painting. The next 3 lines: low green foothills sprawl like grandchildren about the knees of seated elders. Earlier, the large mountains were personified. Now, through simile, the small hills are also compared to people, this time to children. They sprawl like grandchildren about the knees of seated elders. They are sprawled, scattered, strewn about the base of the mountain, the same way children would loosely and playfully gather around the knees of seated elders. These little hills are not as dignified as the mountains. They are not structured with the same rigidity and magnificence of the larger mountains, but are instead scattered about, like a group of fidgeting children made to pose for a photo. We will see that these foothills prove difficult for the artist to properly capture. Lines 14 through 16. And behind them, aloof, shouldering the sky, patriarchal in serenity, Blue Mountain Peak bulks. We see that dominating the background is the Blue Mountain Peak. There is a distinct contrast between the mountains, specifically the Blue Mountain Peak, and these sprawling foothills. The peak is aloof, which is an incredibly brilliant adjective here. First, aloof means in the distance but still within view. This describes the physical presence of the Blue Mountain Peak. But aloofness also connotes a sense of coolness and calmness, a sense of composure, which builds on the dignity mentioned in line 11. The peak is shouldering the sky. This is a metaphor, and one that continues the personification of the mountain. The Blue Mountain Peak seems to be holding up the sky. This is how powerful, how imposing and impressive it appears. This is how much it dominates the sky. Also, to shoulder something in a figurative sense means to bear some sort of burden. The Blue Mountain Peak seems to have a great responsibility, a great purpose. The peak is also patriarchal in serenity. Serenity is similar to aloofness. The peak is peaceful, calm, unbothered. It fears nothing. This matches up with patriarchal. It gives off the vibe of a father, a protector, a leader, a stern and stable patriarch. Then in line 16, we see that the Blue Mountain Peak bulks. This means its size and mass are impressive. But to bulk doesn't just mean to be big, it means to grow, to swell, expand. Remember, the mountains are posing, readying for their portrait to be painted. The Blue Mountain Peak poses by bulking, by swelling up to emphasize and exaggerate its size and might, by flexing its muscles. Saying its peak bulks can be seen as personification, as bulking also means gaining body mass through diet, exercise, and so on. We can imagine the Blue Mountain Peak as a bulky bodybuilder, one who lives in the gym, who drinks nothing but protein shakes and the tears of his enemies. We also get a sense of how domineering and bulky the peak is, with the heavy alliterated B sound in Blue Mountain Peak bulks. Line 17 through 22. And the professional gaze studies positions, impatiently waiting for the perfect moment to fix their preparedness, to confine them for the pleasant formality of the family album. Let's talk about stanza 4 altogether. Remember, the little hills are sprawled out like fidgeting little kids, unsettled, scurrying about. We see that the professional gaze studies their positions. The artist becomes impatient with them. Since the foothills aren't literally moving about, what does this really mean? It means, while the massive mountains and stunning peak are easy to paint because of how prominent and defined they are, the little foothills require more observation, more meticulousness. The smaller the subject, the more difficult it is to capture its details with precision. There are many foothills, each with its unique size, angles of elevation, and positions relative to the mountains. Looking at lines 17 and 18, we see that it is not exactly the artist, but instead his gaze that studies the positions of the hills. This is a vague and debatable piece of personification, one that would suggest that the artist's eyes, just like his tools, are working independent of him. This would support the idea that the creation of art is a process that is beyond the artist, where the artist is merely a vessel that is used by the process itself. Anyhow, the personification of the hills continues. The artist is waiting to fix their preparedness, to confine them. This confinement tells us that he's still trying to tame and bound the landscape in order to fix them onto the canvas. But for the hills and mountains, this is not a landscape painting being made, but a family portrait for the family album. This continues the extended personification of the landscape, the mountains and hills being a family. There have been several references to family up till now. In line 10, the mountains are called a family. In line 13, the small foothills sprawl like grandchildren around their elders. In line 15, the peak is the father. And now they all prepare for this portrait that will be inserted into the family album. The family album might, through metaphor, be the artist's collection of landscape paintings, maybe his collection of paintings of these same mountains. The family album is called a pleasant formality. Getting portraits done for their family albums was and still is a family formality for some fancy upscale families, much like these mountains are. Before we advance to the last stanza, take note of the intriguing use of alliteration throughout the stanza. Look at where the p sounds are positioned. Look how they almost perfectly align vertically from line 17 to line 21. This alliteration could mirror the artist's efforts to align the foothills so he can capture a perfect picture. Lines 23-24. His brush a hummingbird, meticulously poised. The metaphor of the paintbrush being a hummingbird is restated. However, there's an obvious contrast in its behavior as we compare how it behaved in stanza 2 to how it behaves now. Instead of jumping around, it is now poised. To be poised in the context of birds means to be suspended in midair. This is something that only a hummingbird can do reliably. Not only is the bird poised, but it is meticulously poised. It is holding a specific position, being careful and particular about its posture and direction. The word poised here even goes further than that. It also means self-assured and dignified. In order to tackle the painting of these mountains, the bird must assume an air of confidence and certainty. But the third meaning of poised is no less important than the previous two. To be poised also means to be in a state of readiness to do something. As the artist's gaze keenly watches the hills, the paintbrush must be perfectly ready to move at a moment's notice. There is no room for error. We can easily get the sense of the incredible focus and skill, the meticulous attention to detail that is required for creating a perfect landscape painting. The ellipsis after poised further brings the poem to a state of suspension, emphasizing the state of readiness of the hummingbird and the focus of the painter's eyes. Lines 25-26. The little hills fidgeting, changelessly changing. In line 25, we see that while the artist and his tools are at the ready, the little hills are still being elusive. They are still fidgeting, and so they have not yet been captured at the perfect moment from the perfect angle. They are constantly changing. As line 26 puts it, they are changelessly changing, giving us a witty oxymoron that both shows the constancy of the hills fidgeting and the contrast between the hills' movements and the stillness of the painter and his tools. Lines 27-28. Artlessly frustrating the painter's art. These little foothills are artlessly frustrating the painter's art. They are frustrating his art because they are fidgeting about. Imagine how difficult it would be to create a portrait of something that cannot keep still. Again, we see that the art has a life of its own, one separate from the artist's. We also understand that nature is so vast, complex, and dynamic that capturing it within a painting is difficult even for an expert painter. Art is again personified. It is not the artist that is being frustrated, but the art. Finally, look at the word artless. It has several applicable meanings. First, it means genuine, natural. Art is something that is created. If something is artless, there's no artificiality to it, no sense of fabrication. Artless also means ingenuous, naive, childlike. Remember, the foothills are compared to children. They cannot pose and put on any kind of front as the bigger mountains can. Artless also means lacking in skill or knowledge, which is also a fitting description for these childlike, fidgeting hills. But most importantly, the word means poorly made or crude. These little hills are not yet perfect, but they will be made perfect when they are transformed into art, when they are immortalized into the painting. Also, when they are affixed onto the canvas, they will finally stop fidgeting. Then they will become artful. Then they will become art. And that is the point. A simple narrative but written with deep complexity. Let us wrap up by looking at the themes explored in the poem. Relative to the themes explored in the other 19 CSEC poems, this poem comfortably fits into two themes: nature and places. Another major theme in this poem, though difficult to find in other CSEC poems, is art. First, let's look at nature. The poem goes into the art of nature and the nature of art. The artist attempts to capture, to immortalize, to embed greater meaning into a particular piece of nature, the Blue Mountains, by creating a landscape painting of it. To create the perfect portrait, the painter, his tools, and the environment itself must all unite, must come to an understanding. The artist gets as close to nature as he can, ending up on a precarious mountain track where he can not only clearly see, but clearly feel and even become a part of the landscape. The tools of the art become a part of nature as the paintbrush, the paint, and the palette are all transformed into natural elements, with the paintbrush becoming a hummingbird, the paint becoming blooming flowers, the palette becoming the grounds for a garden. Also, the elements of nature are invited to the human side with the extended personification of the mountains being a family. While this poem focuses on a union between man and nature, it also looks at a struggle between man and nature, as the painter, even to the point of frustration, struggles to tame and settle the landscape in order to paint it. Nature is so vast, powerful, and expressive that capturing it in a painting proves an arduous task. Places. The place this poem is centered on is the Blue Mountain Peak, and more generally the Blue Mountains. The mountains are described as an important place, even said to be dignified. The importance of this place might be what leads the artist to attempt a landscape painting of it. Also, it could be the great significance of the mountains that makes creating such a painting difficult for the artist. He must do his best to do this great landscape justice by capturing its intricacies as well as exhibiting the vitality and spirit that dwells within it. Finally, art. The poem gives us a front row seat to the art creation process. Specifically, we see how a landscape painter sets up, confronts, and paints the landscape. We learn that creating art requires such intense focus and patience, as well as a sincere communion with nature. The poem also suggests that the artist must not get in the way of the art, but should instead allow the art to flow and unravel naturally. We see this as the artist's tools are given life of their own, and seemingly act on their own instincts. In this sense, the artist is more of a facilitator than a creator of the art. And that's it for this poem. I'll see you in the next video. And as always, thanks for watching.